Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. You just heard I prepared a lot of letters. I was also not prepared to have to hold a microphone and a presenter, so I might have it might become a bit stumbling over the place, but I hope you will bear with me. And as you might have heard already from Hanno, I am not an actual Hanse historian. What I'm doing is researching the history of the future. And what I would like to do today is to introduce the history of the future as a relatively young subject in historical research to you and apply it to the Hanseatic and the South German sources. So, I hope you can see at least a little bit here. What this is showing is a lot of book titles that show that future-oriented thinking, for example, expectations, hopes, fears, but also plans or goals, is on a high right now in different academic disciplines. Social scientists, neuroscientists, and of course also historians have paid more and more attention to future-oriented thinking over the past decade, and some even longer. Especially neuroscientists like to employ terms like mental time traveling. If you can read that, you can maybe see the term time machine in one of the titles up there. What these neuroscientists mean by that is that we are able to project ourselves mentally into the past based on our memories and into the future based on creative imagination. The neuroscientist Thomas Suddendorf, the second title here, The Invention of Tomorrow, claimed that the future is the most powerful tool at our disposal. According to him, it is one of the main reasons for the evolutionary success of Homo sapiens in controlling his natural environment. For evolutionary psychologists, future anticipation and future-oriented thinking is a phenomenon that characterizes human life as such. And we all know this from our everyday life. Our public debates are full of future climate, of future political developments. As individuals, we think about the future of our families, of our careers, or we might just think about our dinner tonight. And from evolutionary perspective, thinking about next dinner is probably not mundane, but the very important thing about future thinking. But historians are, of course, interested in the changes of future thinking over time in different epochs, in different societies, and in different cultures. They asked, for example, how far did people think into the future? Who was believed to control the future? Was God or humans, kings or the people? What kind of and how many different future scenarios were they considering? Now, the majority of research so far has been focused on the period since roughly 1800, which was and continues to be driven extraordinarily by future expectations and planning. Simply speaking, researchers have hypothesized that there was a major shift in historical future thinking around 1800, and that before 1800, the future was simply not very important in people's lives, because they believed that the future was largely up to God, and that change in the world was so slow that it was hardly experienced and within a single lifetime. They couldn't do anything about the future, and they didn't care much about it. But Hanno has already said that Hanseatic historians were striving towards profit, so something seems to be a bit strange from this perspective. A major problem is that it is very difficult to analyze future thinking systematically and to compare different time periods with each other. And this is exactly what I would like to do in the following. It is to suggest a relatively simple framework that principally allows us to do such comparisons over time. So, what are our sources today? For the sake of demonstration, I will remain at the level of individual cases and explore a bit what we can potentially find out in just very few sentences in one letter from the Veckinchusen family and one letter from the Tucher family. Now, simply speaking, when we read a letter, we just go through this letter and analyze all kinds of future-oriented statements that we can find. As I said in the beginning, expectations, hopes, fears, goals, plans, etc. Then we consider each of these statements from 4 different angles. The first one is temporal distance. So how far did people think ahead? How precise were they with thinking ahead? Secondly, whom did they believe to be in control? Was it God or was it humans? How much could they control themselves? I want to stress here that by control, I do not mean what we reconstruct as historians, what people could control in the past, but what their sense of control was. The third part, certainty, should be self-explanatory. So how certain was a writer that a future event would actually happen? And lastly, desirability. So was an expected future event desirable? Was it undesirable? And for whom was it desirable or undesirable? Now, we can finally have a look at the actual letters. As I said, we will look at one letter from the Veckinchusen collection and one letter from the Tucher collection. From both letters, I took sections from 2 domains of their business life. The first one is dealing with trade, and the other one is dealing with what we might call nowadays staff management. Now, this, what you can probably not read, is a letter by Sievert Veckinchusen, who was writing in Cologne to his brother Hildebrand Veckinchusen in Bruges. I'm going to read out this quote, and then we'll go through the framework I just suggested step by step. I quote, "If it were that you receive money from the fur, I would sell it in Bruges, which shall come in by Candlemas, that is the 2nd of February. So I believe that there will be 20 guilders of loss. I also do not hear that the 525 ducats have been transferred to Venice, because there will be no small loss, which brings me pain. May God better all this. And take good fur again, and we can send that to Venice. There shall be, God willing, no loss." Now, everybody who's familiar with the Veckinchusen letters will know that there's a lot more to say about just this section and about the trade here. But we will only focus on the future horizon now. So, temporal horizon. In this example, we see a concrete date as a deadline for money to be received, the 2nd of February. Trade and financial transactions in particular were embedded in specific calendars. Money transactions or credit settlements were often done at typical dates, or just like nowadays, fixed beforehand at the time when the loan was agreed upon. A typical repayment date would be, for example, fairs, when merchants had sold their goods and then cash available to repay their debts. In most cases, however, as you see in the rest of this quote, the future horizon remains quite vague. There are no specific dates or times mentioned. More precise timings were either self-evident to both the letter writer and the addressee, or they were not able to specify a certain date. Now, let's move on to control. Sievert makes a suggestion or a plan here about what Hildebrand and himself should do. But the final outcome appears to be predetermined already, because Sievert makes a prediction of this loss of 20 guilders. God also features prominently here. He can bring positive change and is, of course, in ultimate control over their situation. But what I would like to point out here is that God is presented in a quite distant, vague position. Such references to God, as here, may God better all this, are very formulaic, and you can find the exact same and in some variations, such formulations all over these letters, both in the Veckinchusen and in the Tucher letters, by the way. God does not show up as somebody who is expected to do anything concrete. This is what humans are doing. And by making plans, they try to shape the future, at least in parts, as far as possible, themselves. God is responsible for the outcome, but they try just to achieve their goals as far as possible. Now, the third point was certainty. And I have to find the right page. If we look at certainty and desirability, Sievert appears relatively certain of what will happen, and it is also clearly undesirable. God is actually the only positive outlook here, but only in a relatively vague hope. But there is another aspect of certainty that I would like to point out, namely a condition or scenario in the beginning of the action. If you remember, he started with, if it were that. So Sievert designs his plan here based on an assumption that may or may not turn out to be true. And if it turns out to be not true, then the whole plan is of course affected by that. Now, we move to the Tucher family and their trade. And this letter was written by Lorenz Tucher, that was a cousin and the business partner of Linhart Tucher. They had a company together where they had both put their capital in. I don't have to say much more about the Tucher family because Hanno already said the most important points, so we can skip that. They are southern merchants, they're in a different business culture, and they have, of course, a different trade. But they wrote letters just as the Veckinchusen letters. The letters look in their structure very similar. So we can move to the example. I quote, "Although our people in Lyon have no hope for a good saffron harvest, you are willing to keep the rest of the old saffron. I tend to agree, although you worry that there might be much more old saffron left. There is no harm in sending sables to Lyon in order to make some profit at the court, while the king is there in case something comes up. May God grant us to make money there." Now, you may have noticed that there are actually two types of trade involved here, saffron and sending sables to Lyon. I will first go through the saffron part and then move to the sables part. Now, the future distance or the temporal horizon here is shaped by the saffron harvest, which took place in October every year, and thus is based on a cyclically recurring season. That means the future outlook is governed by natural rhythms. It gets a bit more complicated here, of course, because there is also talk of old saffron from the previous year, and it is not clear for how long one's own and their competitors' saffron will last. But principally, the future horizon of saffron trade remains within the horizon of the year, added maybe by stocks that have been remaining from the past year. If we consider the control the Tuchers have on the outcome, we can see that most of the decisive factors here are completely out of their control. They can't do anything about the quality of the harvest, nor the strategy of their competitors. They make plans only within these very limited confines of the expected circumstances, and they try to get the best out of what they have left from the past year. While they are pretty certain, although not very precise, about the general outcomes of this year's harvest, they are relatively uncertain about the plan that they still try to make. They could sell some of the remaining saffron, but they have no idea how much their competitors might offer or have left, and hence whether this plan will work out as they hope. If their competitors have much saffron left to offer, the prices will be low, and their profit will of course be affected as well. The outlook is obviously quite pessimistic, but they still seem to have some hope to be able to achieve something with the remaining stock. Their hope is based on the small field that they can influence here. The second part concerns an individual opportunity that is derived from a very concrete situation. The temporal horizon is dependent on the actions of the King of France, Francis I, and accordingly quite vague. The same applies to Tucher's control. They cannot do much more than send and offer their goods. But Lorenz does not link control to the royal court, the potential buyers of their sables, but to God in this case. The outcome is of course highly uncertain, since they are simply making a bet on a possible scenario. The decisive point of such an opportunity is a possibility in the first place, however small it is. That doesn't really matter here. And on the other hand, that there are no undesirable possibilities. And Lorenz is very certain that there will be no undesirable consequences, even if their plan doesn't work out. So we move back to the Veckinchusen letters and their staff management. As I said, this quote is very long, so I will just summarize it and then we go through the scheme again. So Hildebrand and Sievert discuss the employment of a certain Sasse and another Hildebrand here. It's a bit confusing, I know, but the Hildebrand mentioned here is a potential future servant in their company. And they discuss mainly the particular conditions of their employment, their respective rights, both of Sievert and Hildebrand and of Sasse and Hildebrand, and their potential fields of activities. Obviously, the future outlook looks quite different here in comparison with trade. But as I said, let's go through this scheme again. Sievert mentions here 3 distinctive time periods. In the first 2 years, Sasse will have free board, and they will share their capital that will be invested in their trade. Then there follow 5 years during which Sanne will work exclusively for the brothers' company, followed by another 5 years. So in sum, they plan ahead for 12 years of working together. The whole section is of course focused on control. The Veckinchusen brothers would determine a significant degree how Sasse and Hildebrand will live during this time. Sievert and Hildebrand have many rights, Sasse and Hildebrand have obligations. Not everything is under their control though. Sasse and Hildebrand first have to agree to the terms and to the contract, and then they have to actually follow them. They can of course still make mistakes, for example. Sievert and Hildebrand cannot fully control these 2 aspects, which is why Sievert wants to have the right to terminate the contract at all times during these 12 years. And thus of course adds uncertainty again. And as you may have noticed, God does not appear here at all. It is solely a matter of these 4 humans involved. Now, moving on to certainty. Generally, the contract would guarantee that Sievert and Hildebrand can be fairly certain that their future servants will fulfill their wishes. At the same time, this unequal distribution of control or of power leaves open a lot of particularities. For Sievert and Hildebrand, this means a lot of alternative options they can choose from. So basically the tasks that they can give to Sasse and Hildebrand. Whereas the servants, Sasse and Hildebrand, can expect many different tasks. They don't know which task they will have to fulfill. They don't know where they will live. And their contract can be terminated one-sided at all times. So we have very different kinds of a very open future, depending on the perspective of the 2 different parties involved here. Sievert also mentions a potential more precise path that remains to be decided at this point in the quite distant future. He suggests that Sasse and Hildebrand could be put in a more trusted position of journeymen if they turn out to actually live up to the expectations, so make no mistakes, and principally do a good job. From their perspective, so from the Veckinchusen perspective, this could be considered a desirable possibility in a yet quite distant future. And that implies that Sievert expects that this possibility would motivate their servants, Sasse and Hildebrand, and thus raises the certainty, or his certainty, that they will actually do a good job. So again, he makes a plan and tries to make his own future more certain by this possibility. This also leads to desirability. Again, the plan as such implies that the future events and developments, as they are outlined here, are desirable, at least for the Veckinchusen brothers. But Sievert also clarifies what he does not want to happen. For example, you probably can read that. He writes to Hildebrand that he does not want to grant Sasse more than 2 years of free board. So in that, he already considers possibilities that he considers undesirable and tries to prevent them before they even come up. Now, so much for the Veckinchusens. We move on to the last example for now, the Tucher staff management. We have a very similar example in the letter by Lorenz Tucher, although the actual negotiations here are done by a third person who is also working for the Tucher company. So Lorenz Tucher is in Nördlingen, Linhart Tucher is in Nuremberg, and the potential future servant is in Ulm. And the Tuchers have an agent who also is in Ulm and well connected there. So he is doing the actual negotiations. So I'll summarize again. Lorenz reports here what he instructed to this third person, to Linhart Rottengatter, on the terms of the employment of a certain Martin Dalfinger, the potential future servant. Like in the Veckinchusen example, this is essentially a mix of a draft contract and a plan dealing with the company staff management. Here too, we have a clearly defined time frame of 10 years for the contract, so not 12, but 10 years, similar to the Veckinchusen letters, although it is not divided into different periods here. Also, control looks very similar here. Martin Dalfinger only has the option to either commit his life completely to the Tuchers or to refrain from the contract altogether. However, if we consider other letters, this would get a bit more complex because Martin Dalfinger's family also has a say in this, but this doesn't show up in this example. And here too, God does not show up here. Certainty, too, is comparable with the Veckinchusen case regarding the open options and expectations of the two parties. There is only a small difference due to the fact that there is no agreement yet that they will hire Dalfinger at all. In the Veckinchusen case, they were quite similar already. It is still unclear whether the Tuchers will evaluate Dalfinger as a good match for their company in the first place, which is in itself, of course, a future prediction. And they do not know yet whether Dalfinger will agree to the fundamental conditions. Although, and this is the last sentence in this section, Lorenz Tucher adds that Rottengatter just wrote to him that Rottengatter is quite certain that Martin Dalfinger will agree with the terms. Desirability is also comparable with the Veckinchusen case. We are talking about a plan, so the future outline here is desirable. I know that was a lot of detailed information. It was probably not very helpful that you couldn't read anything here. So let me summarize this a little bit. What we find already points to some interesting patterns. On the fundamental level, the Veckinchusen and the Tucher letters seem very similar. The letters as such follow a very general or a very similar structure, and the future plays a comparable and an important role in there. The trade was embedded in social and, at least in the Tucher letters, also natural rhythms. But the outcomes of every individual business deal was highly uncertain. Their future horizon was usually limited to a current cycle with more or less fixed date. They rarely looked beyond one of these cycles. This provided at least a basis for predictability. So within one of these cycles, they could be quite certain, or they could make quite certain or precise predictions. For example, the loss of 20 guilders that Sievert Veckinchusen mentioned. At the same time, trade with different commodities functioned differently, which means that they had to manage a complex set of cycles that only partially overlapped with each other. For example, at the big fairs. So they did not just trade with saffron and fur, but with a lot of other commodities as well. And of course, they were also open to opportunities that opened up outside the typical cycles, just as with the sables that the Tuchers wanted to sell to Lyon. The range of their sense of control was quite limited. Their motivation was mainly based on hope, both to God and on often anonymous circumstances and processes of the market. Altogether, God mainly functions as a personification of uncertainty and a lack of control. These are usually the situations where they call upon God. However, they also had the means to control the lives of their servants to a significant degree in support of their goals. Especially the plans to hire a trading agent look strikingly similar in both cases, but very different from the future within trade. These were very long-term plans that were focused on leaving open a broad range of options for themselves and at the same time preventing negative possibilities. From such insights, of course, we would have to go beyond the individual letter. Only this way we could gain a broader understanding of how the future orientation of Hanseatic merchants or other merchants exactly looked like and in how far they differed from each other. We would also have to link the results to the broader context, to the political situation, to religious beliefs, to legal and business culture, etc. But I still hope that I could give you an interesting insight into the history of the future and what it meant in the lives of Hanseatic merchants. That was it. Thank you very much.
One second.
Did you enjoy this lecture? Come back next year.